The Elector of Hesse also wished to treat, but the emperor was so much offended with that prince that he would not receive his envoy. As to him, said he, his reign is ended. The gates of Magdeburg were opened to Marshal Ney, along with the keys. There was brought to the marshal a little box containing some valuables belonging, as it was said, to the elector. They were found in the fortress. Colbert, Cousterin, and Stettin were capitulating. The Grand Duke had detached to the light cavalry from Prenzlau, and they unexpectedly appeared before the garrison. Evening was advancing. General Lasalle announced that troops were following him. He summoned, threatened, and intimidated the governor, and induced him to come to overtures. But General Billiard arrived, broke off the negotiation, and declared that if the fortress were not surrendered in the space of an hour, he would overwhelm it with cannonballs. The Prussians took the alarm. They imagined that the army, the park, all was ready to destroy them, and they surrendered to our hussars. Cousterin was managed still better. Our troops made a movement to cross the Oder. In course of their march, they fell in with some hundreds of Prussian troops, whom they dispersed. The garrison fired upon them, and balls were flying among our ranks. General Gudin intimated that if the useless firing were not discontinued, the garrison should be immediately blown up. The governor, becoming alarmed, proposed arrangements, but they were rejected. He was told that none could be made. He persisted, but the general continued his march, and there was no one to receive his propositions. A dispatch was sent off to General Petit, who was a considerable distance off. The flag of truce still persisted in coming to arrangements. What arrangement would you have me listen to? Said the general gravely. My instructions are positive. If the garrison be not surrendered in 2 hours, I am ordered to destroy it. We are preparing our batteries. 40 mortars and howitzers will immediately vomit a deluge of fire on your ramparts. There is the colonel of the artillery. It happened, however, to be the colonel of the 85th Regiment of your line, who at that moment came forward. Of the line. You shall see whether I am exaggerating. Colonel, are your guns mounted or your preparations completed? All is ready, General. I only wait your orders. But stay for one moment, sir. We will offer terms of peace. You see, said he to the Prussian officer, your town is about to be destroyed. You may as well avert misfortunes which cannot change the state of affairs. Whether we be defeated or victorious, we will nevertheless make the most of our present advantages, a capitulation or a siege. We care not which. Choose, but choose quickly, and observe that I will treat with none but the governor. The latter soon appeared upon the Oder. General Gautier went to receive the governor and conducted him to a neighboring house. General Petit joined them, and the capitulation was signed. 4,000 Prussians, with stores of provisions and ammunition, surrendered to a regiment of infantry who had not even summoned them and who could not go forward to attack them. These men were justifiable in asking us to cross the Rhine. They found us dangerous neighbors. Napoleon sent a rock to the King of Prussia, but nobody believed there would be peace. As Caulaincourt and I were walking about in the courtyard of the castle, a tall young man with fair hair came up to us and saluted us. This was Prince Paul of Württemberg. He had just quitted the Prussian army in which he had served, contrary to the wish of his father, with whom, as well as with the emperor, he was much out of favor. What is your highness's errand here? Inquired Caulaincourt. The prince replied that he wished to be restored to the good graces of the emperor, and he requested the general to announce him. The Duke de Vicenza agreed to do so, but Napoleon would not receive the prince. He ordered him to be arrested and escorted by an officer of gendarmerie to the States of the King, his father, where he was detained for several years. Caulaincourt exerted every effort to soften the rigors of his captivity. Our headquarters were transferred to Posen. The spirit of insurrection which had manifested itself on the first appearance of our troops burst forth with new violence. Kalisz had disarmed the Prussian garrison, and the example was followed in many other fortresses. Nothing was heard but imprecations upon the authors of the division. Villages, towns, and even the city of Warsaw, though occupied by the Russians, sent deputations and demanded the proclamation of the independence of Poland. I would willingly consent to it, said Napoleon. But if the match were once kindled, who knows where the conflagration might end? My first duty is to attend to the interests of France. I must not sacrifice her for Poland. We must leave the fate of the latter to time. The sovereign who rules all, he alone can shew us what we ought to do. Duroc rejoined us at Posen. We set out for Warsaw. On the way, the Grand Marshal's carriage was overturned, and his clavicle was broken by the fall. Napoleon was very much concerned for the accident. Duroc was a man whose services were almost indispensable to the emperor. He always enjoyed the highest favor and the greatest confidence, which he in every respect deserved. Few men were so distinguished for tact, spirit of business, and skill as Duroc. And at the same time, few were so remarkable for modesty. His devotion to the emperor was without bounds. He had a good heart. He was an honest man. His only fault was his fear of displeasing and his excessive timidity. At length, we entered the Polish capital. The King of Naples had preceded us and had driven the Russians from the city. Napoleon was received with enthusiasm. The Poles thought the moment of their resuscitation had arrived and that their wishes were fulfilled. It would be difficult to describe the joy they evinced and the respect with which they treated us. The French troops, however, were not quite so well pleased. They manifested the greatest repugnance to crossing the Vistula. The idea of want and bad weather inspired them with the greatest aversion to Poland. They were inexhaustible in their jokes and epigrams on the country. They nevertheless beat the Russians in the marshes of Nasilk and at Gulamin and at Pultusk, and subsequently at Eylau. At a review during which the Poles were pressing upon our troops, a soldier in a loud tone of voice vented imprecations on the country and the bad weather. A young female was standing by said, "You are very ungrateful to dislike our country, for we like you very much." "You are very kind," replied the soldier, "but if you wish me to believe you, you must give a good dinner to me and my comrade here." The friends of the young woman took the two soldiers home and regaled them. The French soldiers were particularly fond of passing their jokes at the theater. One evening, when the curtain was very late of rising, a grenadier who was among the spectators became impatient at the delay. "Begin," he called out from the further end of the pit. "Begin directly, or I will not cross the Vistula." Monsieur de Talleyrand, who was driving in his carriage at a short distance from Warsaw, stuck in the mud, and 12 hours elapsed before he could be extricated. The soldiers were much out of humor and inquired who he was. The Minister of Foreign Affairs replied, an individual of his suite. "Why does he come to a country like this with his diplomacy?" said one of the soldiers. The French troops used to say that the four following words constituted the whole language of the Poles. "Kleba, nima, vota, sera." Some bread, there is none, some water, we will go and fetch it. This was all that was to be heard in Poland. Napoleon one day passed by a column of infantry in the neighborhood of Nasilsk, where the troops were suffering the greatest privations on account of the mud which prevented the arrival of provisions. "Papa, Kleba," exclaimed a soldier. "Nima," replied the emperor. The whole column burst into a fit of laughter. They asked for nothing more. I relate these anecdotes because they shew the kind of spirit which animated our troops. These brave veterans deserved more gratitude than they obtained. Napoleon was amused with these jokes, and he smiled whenever allusion was made to the reluctance of the army to cross the Vistula. Some generals augured unfavorably at the disposition of the troops and expressed their regret to find that disgust had succeeded enthusiasm. "Have you spoken to them of the enemy?" said the emperor. "Are they without enthusiasm when they face him?" "Those men," said he to me afterwards, "know not how to appreciate my troops. They do not know that they burn with ardor whenever the Russians and victory are spoken of. I will rouse them." He called one of his secretaries and dictated to him the following proclamations. "Soldiers, this day, 12 months, at this very hour, you were on the memorable field of Austerlitz. The Russian battalions were dismayed and fled in disorder, or were surrounded and compelled to lay down their arms to their conquerors. On the following day, they circulated reports of peace, but these were false. No sooner had they, through generosity that was perhaps reprehensible, escaped the disasters of the third coalition than they plotted a fourth. But the ally on whose tactics they founded their principal hope is no longer what he was. His citadels, his capitals, his magazines, his arsenals, 280 standards, 700 pieces of cannon, 5 great garrisons are in our power. The Oder, the Varta, the deserts of Poland, the severity of the weather have not for a moment impeded your advance. You have braved every danger and surmounted every obstacle. Your enemies everywhere fled at your approach. In vain did the Russians attempt to defend the capital of ancient and illustrious Poland. The French eagle hovers over the Vistula. At your approach, the brave and unfortunate Poles, fancying they again beheld the legions of Sobieski, turning from their memorable expedition. Soldiers, we will not lay down our arms until a general peace shall have established and secured the power of our allies and restored to France her freedom of trade and the possession of her colonies. On the banks of the Elbe and the Oder we have conquered Pondicherry, our establishments in India, the Cape of Good Hope, and the Spanish colonies, which should give the Russians the right of deciding the fate of Europe, which should give them the right of defeating our just designs. Are not they, as well as we, the men who fought at Austerlitz? The troops were assembled in the square of Saxony. It was the anniversary of the coronation, and the Russians occupied the suburb of Prague. These circumstances, these recollections, this perspective of glory were hailed by loud acclamations. Our troops were inspired by the prospect of victory, and all their prejudices vanished. The enemy covered the left bank of the river. All the vessels had been towed away, but one of our quartermasters, in defiance of the Cossack lances, succeeded in getting possession of a boat. This was enough. The enemy raised his camp during the night, and we passed without any impediment. The Bug presented greater difficulties. Its left bank is flat and marshy and well calculated for defense, but Bennigsen knew not how to avail himself of his advantages. We threatened his flanks. We succeeded in floating the boats that had been sunk. The enemy hesitated, and the river was crossed. The Russians returned to the charge. They endeavored to carry the head of the bridge, which we had raised at Okhinev, but all had been foreseen. Davout had adopted every necessary precaution. The enemy was routed, beaten, and compelled to repass the Vikra. Chapter 12. Meanwhile, old Kaminsky had taken the command of the Russian army, and he had fixed his headquarters at Pultusk. His generals concentrated their forces and everything denoted the design of removing to this side of the river. Napoleon hastened forward with the view of driving them from their position. He visited the entrenched camp of Okunev, reconnoitered the river, the position of the Russians, and the plain which it was necessary to cross in order to come up with them. This plain, which was covered with trees, cut down wood, and marshes, was almost as difficult to carry as redoubts, behind which the Cossacks had sheltered themselves. The emperor examined it for a considerable time. Some clumps of trees intercepted his view, but he called for a ladder, and mounting on the roof of a hut, he was enabled to observe the nature of the position occupied by the Russians, and the movements that were taking place on the opposite bank of the river. "We will pass," said he. "Send an officer hither." The second chief of the staff of the Third Corps presented himself and wrote down to the emperor's dictation the following arrangements. The first division is to proceed to the island and to form itself at as great a distance as possible from the enemy. All the troops of the third division must remain at the head of the bridge and are to take no share in the attack. They are to remain in reserve. Battalions are to be formed with the 8 companies of voltigeurs, which, with the battalions of the 13th Light, will form 3 columns. These columns are to proceed as secretly as possible to the 3 extremities of the canal and will halt in the center of the island so as to be beyond reach of the fusillade. Each of these columns will have 3 pieces of cannon in its rear. Each company will detach its cannon, escorted by a company of voltigeurs. These companies will commence the fusillade, covering themselves with the hedges. Meanwhile, the artillery officers will plant their batteries and fire grape shot on the battalions and troops with which the enemy will not fail to oppose our passage. Bridges may be constructed under the protection of this artillery. The 3 columns are to cross the river, and as soon as they shall be stationed on the opposite side, 3 pickets of horse chasseurs, each consisting of 60 men, will cross to charge the enemy, pursue him speedily, and make prisoners. The 17th Regiment will cross immediately after and range itself in order the battle, leaving between each battalion a space of 25 toises, in the rear of which will be stationed 3 squadrons of light cavalry. The remainder of the division will afterwards cross and form itself in the rear. We advanced towards the heights occupied by the enemy, whom we attacked on the right and the left. He was unable to resist the shock and was repulsed. Our troops evinced unexampled valor. Napoleon applauded their courage, and he called Generals Murat and Petit, on whom he bestowed the most flattering compliments. He wished to afford some repose to the corps who had just been engaged, and he detached Friant's division in pursuit of the Russians. Our voltigeurs came up with them at Nasilsk, attacked their left wing, routed, cut them up, and took 3 pieces of cannon. They pursued them into the woods. A fusillade commenced on both sides, and we experienced obstinate resistance. We had no artillery, and we could not drive from their position. Columns, which were protected by the nature of the ground and the grape shot, but the courage of our troops made amends for the deficiency of artillery. The signal for the attack was given. The 48th, led on by the intrepid Barbanegra, rushed headlong upon the enemy's masses and routed them. They had approached, and the darkness enabled them to escape from the thrusts of our bayonets. We collected several pieces of cannon which had stuck in the mud on the road. Some formidable masses of the enemy's force were before us. They did not venture to wait until we came up with them. They fled, some towards Golymin and others towards Pultusk. I pursued those who fled in the former direction with a division of dragoons which the Emperor had entrusted to my command. The Marshal detached Doltan to cover the rear of the 5th Corps, which he knew had proceeded to Pultusk. There had been a complete thaw for the space of 2 days, a circumstance which was uncommon in Poland at that season of the year. The ground over which we passed was a clayey soil intersected with marshes. The roads were excessively bad. Cavalry, infantry, and artillery stuck in the bog, and it cost them the utmost difficulty to extricate themselves. We advanced only a short league in the space of 2 hours. Many of our officers, stuck in the mud, remained there during the whole of the battle of Pultusk. They served as marks for the enemy to shoot at. Oh, terrible. The 3rd Division had no sooner debouched from the village than it was informed by its pioneers that a considerable mass of cavalry covered at some distance a column of artillery and baggage. General Friant ordered them to be watched by detachments of cavalry, as he was well convinced that the cloud of Cossacks would disperse on the appearance of the infantry. They fled, and we took artillery, ammunition, carriages, and caissons of every kind. The general, pleased with these advantages, went to take up a position for the night when a heavy cannonade was heard. It proceeded from Marshal Lannes' forces, who were driven by the Russians from Pultusk. We had our turn on the following day. They occupied a wood whence we wished to dislodge them. Our columns advanced, the voltigeurs were in front, and the infantry were disposed in echelon behind them. We experienced obstinate resistance on the part of the enemy. He attacked us. We charged with the bayonet, and our battalions drove him back on his own masses. We remained masters of this field. It was covered with the bodies of the dead and with bags which the Russians had thrown in order to fly with greater speed. The infantry was dislodged, and the cavalry now advanced. I went forward to meet them and drove them back, but the voltigeurs, who were dispersed about in the marshes, overwhelmed us with their balls. I had my left arm broken. I had been 4 times wounded in the first campaign of the Army of the Rhine under Custine, Pichegru, Moreau, and Desailly, twice before the ruins of Memphis, and in Upper Egypt before the ruins of Thebes, at the Battle of Austerlitz and at Golymin. I also received 4 other wounds at Moscow. I shall hereafter have occasion to mention. From Golymin, I was removed to Warsaw. Napoleon arrived there on the 1st January, and he did me the honor to come and see me. Well, Rapp, said he, you are wounded again, and on your unlucky arm, too. It was the 9th wound which I had received on my left arm, and the Emperor therefore called it my unlucky arm. No wonder. Sire, said I, we are always amidst battles. We shall perhaps have done fighting, he replied, when we are 80 years old. Messieurs Boyer and Ivan dressed my wound in his presence. When Napoleon saw that the bone was really broken, he said, "His arm must be amputated. He is now very ill, and this wound may be his death." Mr. Boyer smiled and said, "Your Majesty would go too hastily to work. The general is young and vigorous. We shall cure him." "I hope," said I, "this is not the last time you will have occasion to make me suffer martyrdom." Napoleon soon left Warsaw for the Battle of Eylau and established his headquarters at Osterode. Here I was appointed to the government of Thorn, whither I was directed to proceed to complete the restoration of my health. I forwarded provisions, artillery, and ammunition to carry on the siege of Danzig. I was now the providence of the Prussian generals. They wrote to me entreating my intercession in their behalf. Blucher himself did not disdain to solicit the grace of His Majesty the Emperor and the King of Italy. He was at first to have been conducted to Dijon, as has been already mentioned, but he had laid down arms and therefore signified little whether he was at Dijon or elsewhere. He was permitted to retire to Hamburg, but he soon tired of that city and begged to be allowed to go to the neighborhood of Berlin. The following is the letter which he addressed to me on the subject. "Mr. General, Your Excellency will probably remember that I had the honor of becoming acquainted with you some years ago on your journey to Munster, and the marks of attention you then condescended to show me induce me to hope that the unfortunate situation in which I am now placed will not be absolutely indifferent to you. I take the liberty of addressing Your Excellency to entreat your intercession with His Majesty the Emperor of France and King of Italy, that he may graciously order passports to be granted for myself, the 2 officers of my sons, and the rest of my family, to enable us to retire to the environs of Berlin or into Pomerania, to one of my estates. Having lost my all by the chances of war, I find it impossible to support the expenses attending a residence in a city where everything is so enormously dear as in Hamburg. Moreover, I am in ill health, and I feel that it is only by living in the bosom of my family and leading a very retired life that I shall be able to recover myself. These reasons and the generosity of His Majesty the Emperor induce me to hope that he will deign to relieve my painful situation by permitting me to make choice of a place of residence, and the protection which Your Excellency may condescend to grant me in this affair will add feeling of the deepest gratitude to the sentiments of high consideration with which I have the honor to be Your Excellency's very humble and very obedient servant, Blucher. Hamburg, November 15th, 1806. The Emperor refused to grant the request, but the general cannot have forgotten the manner in which I treated him. It is in his power to say whether the French know how to respect misfortune. On the surrender of Danzig, I was appointed governor of the city with the rank of general-in-chief. Napoleon arrived at Danzig on the 29th of May, and he spent 2 days there. He expected that this new acquisition would afford immense resources, particularly in specie. I received the strictest orders to collect the contributions, which amounted to 20 millions and which were extended to 30 in provisions by the treaty which I sometimes after entered into with the town. I was furnished with a carte blanche and was authorized to adopt any means I chose for effecting the collection, but I found the thing impossible. It occasioned me the greatest annoyance. Sometimes one measure of severity was resorted to, and sometimes another. The common people, as well as the richest and most considerable of the citizens, were all threatened in their turns. I constantly used my utmost endeavor to elude these violent orders. I spared the inhabitants of Danzig many causes of discontent. At the peace, they still owed 17 million of contributions. Napoleon was present at the battles of Halsburg and Friedland. 8 days later, after his departure, he wrote to me as follows: "Monsieur de Talleyrand will proceed to Danzig and will stay with you some time. You will receive and treat him like a prince. You are aware of the esteem and attachment I entertained for that minister, etc. He might have escaped many misfortunes had he never quarreled with Talleyrand." After the Treaty of Tilsit, Napoleon sent me private instructions. He informed me of the probability of peace and ordered me to keep a vigilant eye over Prussia and the royal family. He was still incensed against William and his subjects. I could not guess the reason. Berthier explained it to me, and I did not think it a just one. Berthier came to Danzig to deliver me fresh instructions and to remind me of the directions I had received to be on my guard against the plots which might be hatching around me. I was to remain at Danzig until the cessation of hostilities. The Russians were for us. We had fine sport with the English. In less than 2 years, those islanders were to be obliged to sue for peace. In fine, I remained at Danzig. I corresponded directly with Napoleon. Most of his letters evinced an extraordinary degree of dissatisfaction in which I must confess I myself participated for a considerable time. The language and conduct of some Prussian officers contributed to keep up the prejudice against them. I treated them with great severity. The least fault was punished to the utmost. But at the same time, I always rendered them justice and never allowed them to be molested. Tranquility, however, was restored. Each party mutually laid aside their animosity, and confidence was reestablished. I saw and received the Prussians, and I may say that from the first year after I obtained the command, all the reports which I forwarded to Paris were distinguished by moderation and truth. I represented to Napoleon that it was difficult for the Prussians so soon to forget their former greatness, that the public mind was becoming tranquil, and that the king, the ministers, and the royal family never ceased to recommend to the people that resignation which misfortune renders indispensable. I always wrote to this purport. I had no cause to complain of anyone. For my own part, I was on very good terms with the civil and military authorities. I saw them frequently, and all of them, I may say, placed the greatest confidence in me. They were sensible of the justice of my proceedings. All the commandants, however, did not act in the same way. Their reports and the disasters of Berlin excited fresh doubts in Napoleon's mind with regard to the conduct of Prussia. He charged me to double my vigilance. Overlook nothing in the Prussians, he said to me in one of his letters. They must not be allowed to raise their heads. The news of the disasters which we had experienced in the peninsula at length spread over Germany and awakened new hopes. The public mind was violently agitated. I informed Napoleon of this, but he disliked the revival of painful recollections and was still more averse to unpleasing anticipations of the future. He replied to me, Germans are not Spaniards. The character of the German bears no resemblance to that of the fierce Catalonian. Chapter 18. The interview of Erfurt took place. Napoleon set out for Spain. He attacked and dispersed all that were opposed to him, and the English army would have been destroyed had he been enabled to pursue it himself. But the Fourth Austrian War broke out, and he was obliged to hurry to the assistance of Bavaria. Prince Berthier sent me orders to rejoin the army. The emperor was already with it. I found him at Landshut just after he had gained the Battle of Ratisbon. I was not well pleased with my reception. He asked me dryly, how do your Prussians and Danzigers get on? You ought to have made the latter pay me. They owe me. You see, we have not all been killed in Spain. I still have men enough left to beat the Austrians. I felt the illusion. We marched on Vienna. The emperor became more good-humored and treated me more kindly. The Battle of Esslingen took place. Thousands of brave men lost their lives. Marshal Lannes was disabled. The cavalry and artillery were destroyed. The village of Esslingen, the most important point that remained for us to defend, was inundated by 20 battalions of Hungarian grenadiers. We could no longer maintain our station. The enemy had already penetrated into the square work, which Napoleon had directed to be fortified the day before. Count Lobau advanced to meet them and checked their progress, but they immediately received reinforcements. The emperor perceived this, and I was directed to take 2 battalions of the Young Guard and to hasten the assistance of our troops. I was to disengage them, to effect a retreat with them, and to take a position between the village and the remainder of the guard on the banks of the Danube. Near the bridge, which had been broken, the Austrian columns advanced from all quarters on this point. Our position became most hazardous. On our left, Massena still occupied Gross Alpern. He had lost great numbers of his force, but he still maintained his ground. I placed myself at the head of my 2 battalions and entered the village. I drew up my troops in the rear of General Mouton and went to deliver him the emperor's orders, but the whole of the enemy's reserve under the command of the Archduke Charles deployed at some distance. You have, said I to Count Lobau, astonished those masses by your resistance. Let us charge them with the bayonet and drive them back upon the columns that are advancing. If we succeed, the emperor and the army will give us credit for our success. If we fail, the responsibility will rest with me. With both of us, replied the general. Our 5 battalions moved forward, charged, repulsed, and dispersed the enemy at the point of the bayonet. We were masters of the village. The Archduke endeavored in vain to recover it 5 times. He led his troops to the charge, and 5 times he was defeated. He experienced immense loss. Ours was also considerable. Generals Mouton and Gros were wounded. Several other officers were killed. Napoleon was delighted with this affair. He complimented me very highly and added, if ever you did well in not executing my orders, you have done so today, for the safety of the army depended on the taking of Esslingen. Napoleon thought that the people of Vienna were more unfavorable to us than in our preceding campaigns. He made the remark to me. I replied that despair had contributed greatly to produce the feeling that the people were everywhere tired of us and of our victories. He did not like this sort of reflection. Schill was then traversing Saxony. Napoleon was informed of the circumstance and was vexed at it. This was a mode of sounding the public opinion. Prussia was making a prelude to that insurrectionary war which he afterwards maintained against us. I confess I did not believe the fact when I heard it. I entertained too high an opinion of the national loyalty. I endeavored to subdue the emperor's prejudices, but his suspicions were stronger than anything I could say to remove them. In other circumstances contributed to render them distrustful. The conduct of the Russians was not more frank than that of the Prussians. They were shuffling. This want of good faith rendered him furious. He resolved to be revenged on them. But he required time for that. The Battle of Wagram took place. I was not engaged in it. 3 days before the battle, I had accompanied Napoleon to the island of Lobau. I was in one of the Emperor's carriages with General Lauristone. We were overturned, and I had one of my shoulders dislocated and 3 ribs broken. The Emperor pursued the enemy as far as Nîmes and returned to establish himself at Schönbrunn, where he afterwards learned the defeat and the death of Schill. This news gave him satisfaction, though he would have been better pleased had that partisan been taken prisoner.